She was his assistant, quiet and loyal, until her trembling lips broke the billionaire's heart. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. She knew she shouldn't be thinking about him while organizing his calendar, but she did it anyway. Camille Evans adjusted her reading glasses for the third time in 10 minutes, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled through Julian Carrington's impossibly packed schedule. The 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower hummed with the quiet efficiency of wealth and power, but in her small corner office adjacent to his, time seemed to move differently, more deliberately, more dangerously. 5 years. 5 years of arriving at 6:30 a.m. to ensure his coffee was the perfect temperature when he walked through those glass doors at exactly 7:15. 5 years of anticipating his needs before he voiced them, of reading the subtle shift in his jaw when a deal was going south, of perfecting the art of being indispensable while remaining invisible. The intercom buzzed, pulling her from thoughts she had no business entertaining. "Camille, could you bring the Hartwell contract to my office?" His voice carried that familiar, controlled cadence that made every request sound like a gentle command. "Of course, Mr. Carrington." She steadied her voice, though her heart quickened at the prospect of being in the same room with him. Again, she gathered the thick manila folder, her dark fingers careful not to wrinkle the edges. Julian was particular about details. It was one of the many things that made him a billionaire before 40, and one of the many things that made her job both challenging and oddly intimate. She knew how he liked his documents arranged, his pens positioned, even how he preferred the blinds angled to avoid glare during afternoon meetings. The walk to his office was only 20 steps, but it felt like crossing a bridge she'd been building for years without realizing it. Julian's corner office was a testament to refined masculinity, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, dark mahogany furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars, and not a single personal photograph in sight. He stood with his back to the door, silhouetted against the grey December sky, his broad shoulders rigid with the kind of tension that came from carrying an empire. "The Hartwell projections are on page 15, Camille said softly, placing the folder on his desk with practiced precision. "I've also included the environmental impact assessments you requested." He turned then, and for a moment, just a moment, their eyes met in a way that felt different from their usual professional exchanges. Julian Carrington had the kind of presence that commanded rooms, but his eyes held something quieter, something that looked almost lonely. "Thank you." He moved to his desk, his movements economical and precise. "How long have you been working late this week?" The question caught her off guard. In 5 years, he'd never asked about her personal time. "It's nothing I can't handle," she replied, though the truth was she'd been staying until nearly 9 every evening, partly because of the increased workload, but mostly because going home to her empty Brooklyn apartment felt less appealing than being in the same building as him. Julian's fingers paused over the contract pages. "That wasn't what I asked." Camille felt heat rise in her cheeks. There was something about his directness that always managed to slip past her carefully constructed professional armor. "Monday until 8:30, Tuesday until 9:15, Wednesday." She stopped herself, realizing how pathetic it sounded. "I don't mind the hours, Mr. Carrington." "Julian." The word hung in the air between them like something fragile and dangerous. "I'm sorry? When it's just us, you can call me Julian." He looked up from the papers, and this time he didn't look away. "I think after 5 years, we can manage that level of informality." The room felt smaller suddenly, the space between them charged with something she couldn't name, but had been feeling for months. Years, if she was being honest with herself. "All right, Julian." His name tasted different on her lips when spoken aloud. More intimate, more real. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the perfect composure he wore like armor. For just a second, he looked like a man who'd been holding his breath for a very long time. The moment stretched between them, full of words that couldn't be said and feelings that couldn't be acknowledged. Then his phone rang, shattering the silence like glass. As Julian reached for the phone, Camille turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "Camille?" She looked back, her hand on the door handle. "Thank you. For everything you do, I know I don't say it enough." Walking back to her desk, Camille's heart hammered against her ribs. In 5 years of working for Julian Carrington, he'd never thanked her personally, never used her first name with such careful deliberation, never looked at her like she was anything more than an exceptionally efficient piece of office equipment. But as she settled back into her chair, staring at her computer screen without seeing it, one thought echoed in her mind with terrifying clarity. Something had just changed between them, and she wasn't sure either of them was prepared for what came next. What do you think happens when the lines between professional and personal start to blur? Have you ever found yourself falling for someone you knew you shouldn't? The next morning arrived with the kind of December chill that made Manhattan feel like a different city entirely. Camille stood in the lobby of Meridian Tower at 6:25 a.m., 5 minutes earlier than usual, clutching a steaming cup of coffee and trying to convince herself that yesterday's moment meant nothing. But as the elevator climbed toward the 42nd floor, her reflection in the polished steel doors told a different story. She'd chosen her burgundy blouse more carefully this morning, applied her lipstick with extra attention, and caught herself checking her appearance twice before leaving her apartment. The office was tomb quiet when she arrived, just the way she preferred it. These early morning minutes belonged to her, a sacred ritual of preparation that made her feel like she was crafting something beautiful rather than just managing a schedule. She moved through her routine with practiced grace, adjusting the blinds to catch the morning light just right, organizing Julian's desk with military precision, ensuring his coffee would be exactly 140 degrees when he arrived. But today, something felt different. The air itself seemed to hold yesterday's conversation, thick with possibility and danger. At exactly 7:15, the glass doors whispered open. "Good morning, Camille." Julian's voice carried the same controlled politeness as always, but she caught something new underneath, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, Mr. Carrington." The formal address felt strange now, like wearing a coat that no longer fit properly. He paused at her desk, longer than usual. "Julian," he corrected gently. "Remember?" The way he said it made her stomach flutter in a way that had no place in a professional environment. "Right, Julian." His smile was barely there, just a slight upturn at the corner of his mouth, but it transformed his entire face. For a moment, the billionaire CEO looked almost boyish. "Is that a new coffee blend?" he asked, nodding toward his office where his morning cup waited. Camille blinked in surprise. In 5 years, Julian had never commented on his coffee. She'd simply observed his preferences and adjusted accordingly, a skill she'd perfected with the quiet dedication of someone who cared too much about details. "It's Ethiopian, single origin. I noticed you seem to enjoy the more complex flavors, so She stopped herself before admitting she'd spent her lunch break yesterday at 3 different coffee shops, asking questions about flavor profiles and growing regions. "You noticed." He said it like a revelation. "Thank you, that's thoughtful." The word thoughtful hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them was ready to explore. As Julian disappeared into his office, Camille tried to focus on her computer screen, but her attention kept drifting to the soft sounds coming from behind his door. The rustle of papers, the quiet tap of his fountain pen, the almost inaudible sigh he made when reviewing particularly complex contracts. Around 10 a.m. her concentration was broken by an unexpected visitor. "Excuse me, are you Camille Evans?" A woman in her early 50s approached her desk, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that screamed old money. "Yes, how can I help you?" "I'm Vivian Carrington, Julian's mother." Camille's blood turned to ice. In 5 years, Julian's mother had never set foot in this office, never even called directly. She was a phantom presence in his life, mentioned only in hushed tones by other executives who spoke of her legendary social influence and her complicated relationship with her son. "Mrs. Carrington, what a pleasure to meet you." Camille stood, extending her hand with professional courtesy, while her mind raced through protocols she'd never needed to consider. Vivian's handshake was firm, her gaze assessing. "I was hoping to speak with Julian, but I understand he's in meetings all morning." "He is, but I could see if—" "Actually, I was hoping to speak with you first." Vivian's smile was polished and sharp. "I've heard quite a lot about his exceptional assistant. Julian rarely speaks so highly of his staff." The words should have been a compliment, but something in Vivian's tone made them feel like a warning. "I simply do my job, Mrs. Carrington." "Oh, I'm sure you do much more than that." Vivian's eyes swept over Camille's desk, taking in the perfectly organized chaos of Julian's business life. "Tell me, dear, how long have you been working so closely with my son?" The emphasis on closely was subtle, but unmistakable. 5 years, Mom. 5 years. Vivian repeated the words as if they were evidence in a trial. "That's quite a long time to maintain such professional dedication." Before Camille could respond, Julian's office door opened. He emerged, phone pressed to his ear, but stopped mid-sentence when he saw his mother. "I'll call you back, Peterson." He ended the call, his expression shifting into something carefully neutral. "Mother, this is unexpected." "Hello, darling." Vivian moved toward him with the kind of graceful confidence that came from a lifetime of commanding rooms. "I was just getting acquainted with your assistant. She's exactly as you described." Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "How exactly did I describe her?" "Indispensable," Vivian said smoothly. "Essential, the kind of employee one simply cannot function without." The air in the office suddenly felt thin. Camille watched the exchange with growing unease, sensing undercurrents she didn't understand but instinctively feared. "Camille is highly skilled," Julian said carefully. "We work well together." "I'm sure you do." Vivian's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Well, I should let you both get back to your work. Camille, it was lovely meeting you." As Vivian glided toward the elevator, Julian remained frozen by his office door, watching her leave with an expression Camille had never seen before. Not anger, exactly. Something deeper, something that looked almost like resignation. When the elevator doors closed, he turned to Camille, and for the first time since she'd known him, Julian Carrington looked genuinely vulnerable. "I should explain." "You don't owe me any explanations," Camille said quickly, though every cell in her body was screaming for understanding. "Yes," he said quietly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I think I do." The explanation came 3 hours later, after Julian's last meeting ended, and the office had emptied into the grey December afternoon. Camille was finishing the quarterly reports when she heard his office door open. She didn't look up immediately. She'd learned to read his moods by the sound of his footsteps, and these were slower than usual, heavier with something that felt like dread. Camille. Her name sounded different when he was tired, less controlled, more human. "Could you come in here, please?" She found him standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the early darkness. His usually perfect posture had softened, making him look less like a corporate titan and more like a man carrying invisible weights. "Close the door," he said without turning around. The soft click of the door seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet office. Camille had been in this room thousands of times, but never like this, never with the kind of intimate tension that made every breath feel significant. "My mother has very specific ideas about what my life should look like," Julian began, his voice directed toward the window rather than her. "Who I should marry, where I should live, which social circles I should navigate. She's been orchestrating my personal life since I was old enough to hold a conversation at her dinner parties." Camille remained silent, sensing that this was the kind of revelation that required patience. 3 years ago I was engaged. He turned then, and the vulnerability in his expression hit her like a physical blow. Sophia Whitmore. Old family, appropriate pedigree, everything my mother had ever wanted in a daughter-in-law. The name hung in the air like a ghost. Camille felt something twist in her chest, jealousy mixed with an ache she couldn't name. "What happened?" she asked softly. Julian's laugh was bitter. "I realized I was marrying a stranger, someone I'd never had a real conversation with, never shared an honest moment with. We looked perfect together in photographs, but when we were alone," he shook his head, "there was nothing there. No connection, no understanding. Just two people playing roles my mother had written for us." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow she'd never noticed before. "I called off the engagement 2 weeks before the wedding. 300 guests, deposits on venues across the city, my mother's social reputation. None of it mattered when I realized I was about to commit my life to someone who saw me as nothing more than a title and a bank account." "That must have been difficult," Camille said, though the words felt inadequate. "The difficult part wasn't calling it off," Julian said quietly. "The difficult part was realizing I'd been sleepwalking through my own life, going through the motions of what everyone expected without ever asking what I actually wanted." The space between them felt charged, electric with unspoken understanding. Camille found herself studying the way the lamplight caught the silver threads in his dark hair, the way his usually perfect tie had been loosened just enough to reveal the hollow of his throat. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "Because my mother didn't come here today to meet you," Julian said, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "She came here because someone told her I've been different lately, happier, more present, and she wanted to see what was causing that change." Camille's breath caught. "Julian, For the past few months, I've been looking forward to coming to work in a way I never have before. Not because of the deals or the meetings or the conquests. He stepped closer, close enough that she could catch the faint scent of his cologne, cedar, and something uniquely him. Because of you. Because of the way you anticipate what I need before I know it myself. Because of how you make the smallest gestures feel like gifts. Because when you're here, this place feels less like a prison and more like what? She whispered. Like home. The words settled between them like a confession. Camille felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the raw honesty in his voice. Your mother was warning me, she said, understanding flooding through her. She was telling me to stay in my place. My mother is terrified that I'll make another decision she can't control, Julian said, his voice hardening slightly. But I'm 39 years old, Camille. I've built an empire, employed thousands of people, made decisions that affect global markets. I think I can choose who I spend my time with. The weight of his words hung in the air. Camille felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, the careful professional distance she'd maintained for 5 years, crumbling like paper in rain. This is complicated, she said, though her heart was screaming the opposite. The best things usually are. Julian reached out, his fingers barely grazing her wrist, but the contact sent electricity shooting up her arm. I know this changes everything. I know it makes your job impossible and puts you in a difficult position. If you want to transfer to another department, I'll understand. I'll make sure you get whatever position you want, whatever salary. No, the word came out stronger than she'd intended. I don't want to leave. Something shifted in Julian's expression, relief mixed with something that looked dangerously close to hope. Then what do you want? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Camille looked at him, really looked at him. Not as her boss, not as the untouchable billionaire, but as the man who just stripped away every defense and offered her his truth. I want, she began, then stopped, terrified of the words that wanted to follow. Outside, the city hummed with evening traffic and distant sirens, but inside Julian's office, the only sound was the thundering of two hearts, learning what it meant to risk everything. I want to know what happens next, she finally said. Julian's smile was slow and devastating. So do I. The morning after felt like walking on glass. Camille stood in her tiny Brooklyn kitchen at 5:30 a.m., holding her coffee mug with both hands, as if it could anchor her to something solid. She'd barely slept, replaying every word of their conversation, every look, every moment when the air between them had crackled with possibility and danger. I want to know what happens next. Her own words echoed in her mind as she watched steam rise from her cup. What had she been thinking? 5 years of perfect professionalism, of careful boundaries, of being exactly what Julian needed her to be, and she'd thrown it all away for a moment of honesty that felt like jumping off a cliff. But God, the way he'd looked at her when she said it, like she'd just handed him something precious he'd been searching for his entire life. The subway ride to Manhattan felt endless. Every stop brought her closer to a reality she wasn't sure she was ready to face. What would today look like? How did you go back to scheduling meetings and organizing files when you just admitted you wanted to explore something that could destroy everything you'd built? Her hands shook slightly as she swiped her badge at Meridian Tower's security desk. Morning, Camille, called Marcus, the security guard who'd been greeting her for 5 years. You're early, even for you. Couldn't sleep, she managed, forcing a smile. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending to her own judgment. When the doors opened, she was surprised to find the office already softly lit. Julian's briefcase sat on his desk. His coat hung on its usual hook, but he was nowhere to be seen. Camille set down her purse and moved through her morning routine with mechanical precision. But everything felt different. The coffee ritual felt too intimate now. Adjusting his papers felt like touching something sacred. Even the familiar hum of the office seemed to whisper about the line they'd crossed. You're thinking too loud. She spun around to find Julian emerging from the small conference room, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He was impeccably dressed as always, but there was something softer about him this morning. His tie loosened slightly, his hair not quite as perfectly styled. I brought you coffee, he said, offering her one of the cups. Ethiopian, single origin. The gesture was so simple, so thoughtful, that it nearly undid her completely. In 5 years, he'd never brought her coffee. She'd always been the one taking care of him. Thank you, she whispered, accepting the cup. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and the contact sent electricity shooting up her arm. They stood there for a moment, drinking coffee in the early morning quiet, and it felt both completely natural and utterly revolutionary. How are you feeling about yesterday? Julian asked, his voice carefully neutral. Terrified, Camille answered honestly. You? Terrified, he echoed, and they both laughed. Soft, nervous sounds that seemed to release some of the tension. Julian, she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice her fears. Whatever you're thinking, just say it, he encouraged. We're past the point of careful words, don't you think? She took a breath. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be your assistant and whatever else this might become. I don't know how to navigate your mother's disapproval or office gossip or any of it. Julian set down his coffee and moved closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his dark eyes. I don't know either, he admitted. I've never wanted something that felt this complicated and this simple at the same time. But I know I can't pretend yesterday didn't happen. I can't go back to treating you like just an employee when you're so much more than that. What am I then? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You're the person who makes me remember what it feels like to be human, he said simply. You're the first thing I think about when I wake up, and the last thing I think about before I sleep. The office door chimed, and they sprang apart like guilty teenagers. Camille busied herself with papers, while Julian straightened his tie, both of them trying to look professional, as footsteps approached. Good morning, Mr. Carrington. The voice belonged to David Chen, one of the junior executives. I have the Morrison contracts you requested. Of course, thank you, David. Julian's voice was perfectly controlled again, but Camille caught the slight strain beneath the surface. As David left, the spell was broken. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed harsher now, reminding them both of the reality they were trying to navigate. We should probably... Camille gestured vaguely at their respective workstations. Right, of course. Julian nodded, but his eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. Camille? Yes? This conversation isn't over. I know. As Julian disappeared into his office, Camille sank into her chair, her heart racing. She'd thought the hardest part would be admitting her feelings. Now she realized that was just the beginning. The real challenge was figuring out how to build something beautiful, while the whole world seemed designed to tear it down. Her computer chimed with an incoming email, and her blood ran cold when she saw the sender. Vivian Carrington. Dear Ms. Evans, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. I was wondering if you might have time for lunch today. I find myself quite curious about the woman who has become so essential to my son's daily life. Regards, Vivian Carrington. Camille stared at the screen, her hands trembling slightly. Julian's mother wasn't making a social invitation. She was issuing a summons. Through the glass walls of his office, she could see Julian on a conference call, animated and confident in his element. He had no idea that the battle for their future was about to begin over white tablecloths and polite conversation. She looked at the email again, then at Julian, then back at the screen. With fingers that felt disconnected from her body, she began to type her response. The restaurant Vivienne had chosen spoke volumes before a single word was exchanged. Le Bernardin sat like a temple of Manhattan's elite, all pristine white tablecloths and hushed conversations that carried the weight of million-dollar decisions. Camille felt underdressed, despite wearing her best navy suit, the one she'd bought for Julian's most important board meetings. Here, surrounded by women whose jewelry probably cost more than her annual salary, she felt like an imposter wearing a costume. Vivienne was already seated at a corner table when Camille arrived, her silver hair arranged in an elegant chignon that probably required a team of stylists. She wore understated pearls and a smile that could cut glass. Camille, darling, thank you for joining me. Vivienne's voice carried the kind of cultured warmth that felt like a well-rehearsed performance. I took the liberty of ordering us the tasting menu. I hope you don't mind seafood. That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Carrington. Camille settled into her chair, hyper-aware of every gesture under Vivienne's calculating gaze. Please call me Vivienne. We're practically family, aren't we? You've been taking such excellent care of my son. The waiter appeared with champagne flutes filled with something that probably cost more than Camille's monthly Metro card. Vivienne raised her glass with practiced elegance. To exceptional service, she said, and the toast felt like a warning wrapped in silk. They made small talk through the first course, Vivienne inquiring about Camille's background with the kind of polite interest that felt like an interrogation. Brooklyn born and raised, business degree from a state school, no family connections to speak of. Each answer seemed to be filed away like evidence. Julian speaks so highly of your organizational skills, Vivienne said as the second course arrived. He's always been particular about efficiency. Even as a child, he needed everything in its proper place. He's very detail-oriented, Camille agreed carefully. It makes my job easier when I know exactly what's expected. I imagine it does. Vivian's smile sharpened. Tell me, in your 5 years working for him, have you noticed any changes in his behavior recently? The question hung in the air like smoke. Camille felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. Mr. Carrington is consistently professional, she said. Mr. Carrington? Vivian's eyebrow arched slightly. How formal, though I suppose maintaining proper boundaries is essential in your position. The words were a scalpel, precise and cutting. Camille realized this wasn't just lunch, it was surgery, and she was the patient. Boundaries are important in any professional relationship, Camille replied, though the words felt hollow after yesterday's conversation. Vivian leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a more intimate register. You know, I've spent 39 years watching my son navigate this world. He's brilliant, of course, but he's also vulnerable in ways that people don't see, particularly when it comes to matters of the heart. Camille's breath caught, but she forced herself to remain still. Julian has a tendency to romanticize situations, Vivian continued, to see depth and connection where there might simply be gratitude or admiration or the comfort of routine. It's one of his most endearing qualities, but also one of his most dangerous. I'm not sure I understand what you're implying. Oh, I think you understand perfectly. Vivian's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. You're an intelligent woman, Camille. You've built a comfortable life around my son's needs, a good salary, excellent benefits, job security in an uncertain world. It would be natural to feel attached to that stability. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Camille felt heat rise in her cheeks, anger mixing with humiliation. Mrs. Carrington, Vivian, she corrected smoothly. And please, don't misunderstand me. I'm not questioning your professional competence. You've been excellent at your job. But jobs change, darling. People move on. What concerns me is my son's tendency to confuse professional dedication with something more personal. Camille set down her fork, her appetite completely gone. With all due respect, I think you're misreading the situation. Am I? Vivian's smile was razor-sharp now. Then you won't mind me sharing a little family history. 3 years ago, Julian was engaged to a lovely young woman, Sophia Whitmore. Perhaps you've heard the name. Old New York family, impeccable breeding, everything a man in his position could want. Camille's stomach twisted, but she remained silent. The wedding was planned for 6 months. 6 months of preparations, of merging two of the city's most influential families. And then 2 weeks before the ceremony, Julian called it off. Do you know what he told me? Camille shook her head, though she suspected she was about to hear a version of the story very different from Julian's. He said he didn't love her, that he felt more connection with. Vivian paused delicately. Well, with someone he saw every day, someone who understood him in ways Sophia never could, someone who anticipated his needs and made his life feel complete. The words landed like stones in Camille's chest. Mrs. Carrington, I think you're his therapist, Vivian finished. A lovely woman named Dr. Elizabeth Moore, very professional, very dedicated to her patients. Julian had been seeing her for stress management, and somewhere along the way, he convinced himself that her professional care was something deeper. Camille felt the blood drain from her face. Dr. Moore handled it beautifully, of course. She helped Julian understand that what he was feeling was transference, a common psychological phenomenon where patients develop romantic feelings for their caregivers. She referred him to a colleague and maintained strict boundaries. Julian was devastated at first, but eventually he realized she was right. Vivian reached across the table and patted Camille's hand with false sympathy. I'm telling you this because I can see the same pattern happening again. Julian is a man who responds to care and attention, and in his position those qualities are rare. It's easy for him to mistake professional devotion for something more romantic. And what about what I feel? Camille asked quietly, surprised by her own boldness. Vivian's eyes sharpened. What you feel, darling, is the security of being needed by a powerful man. It's intoxicating, I'm sure. But is it worth destroying a career you've worked 5 years to build? Is it worth the inevitable heartbreak when Julian realizes he's made the same mistake twice? The restaurant seemed to spin around Camille. She thought of Julian's words yesterday, the vulnerability in his eyes, the way he'd said she made him feel human. Had it all been just a pattern repeating itself? I can offer you something, Vivian said, her voice gentle now, almost motherly. Her position with the Whitmore family's charitable foundation, executive assistant to the director, 40% salary increase, full benefits, and a clean slate. All you have to do is submit your resignation and allow Julian to find someone more appropriate for his current needs. Camille stared at the older woman, understanding flooding through her. This wasn't concern for Julian's well-being. This was a chess move, calculated and ruthless. And if I refuse? Vivian's smile never wavered, but her eyes went cold. Then I suppose we'll see how strong Julian's feelings really are when they're tested by reality. Professional relationships that become personal rarely survive the scrutiny they inevitably attract. The check arrived as if summoned by magic. Vivian placed her platinum card on the silver tray without looking at the total. Think about my offer, dear. You have until Monday to decide. As Vivian glided away, leaving Camille alone at the table with the debris of their elegant meal, one thought echoed in her mind. She had just been given an ultimatum by one of the most powerful women in New York, and she had no idea how to fight back. Camille returned to the office feeling like she'd been hollowed out from the inside. The familiar hum of the 42nd floor felt foreign now, every sound amplified and strange. She moved through the afternoon like an actress who'd forgotten her lines, mechanically answering phones and organizing files, while Vivian's words echoed in her mind like a poison song. Julian has a tendency to romanticize situations, to see depth and connection where there might simply be gratitude or admiration, or the comfort of routine. Every time she looked toward Julian's office, she found herself analyzing his behavior through this new, terrible lens. The way he'd smiled at her this morning, was it genuine affection or just appreciation for someone who made his life easier? The coffee he'd brought her, was it a romantic gesture or simple reciprocity? By 6 o'clock, most of the office had emptied out, but Julian remained in his glass sanctuary, silhouetted against the city lights as he worked late into the evening. Camille gathered her things with unusual haste, desperate to escape before he noticed her strange mood. She was almost to the elevator when his voice stopped her. Camille. Not her full name, but the shortened version he'd started using since yesterday. It sounded different now, less intimate, more like a habit than a choice. She turned, forcing a professional smile. "Yes, Mr. Carrington." His expression shifted at the formal address. "Are you leaving already?" "It's barely 6. I finished everything that needed to be done today." The lie came easily, though her desk was covered with tasks she'd normally complete before leaving. Julian emerged from his office, concern creasing his features. "Are you feeling all right? You seem distant this afternoon." Distant, as if she'd pulled away instead of been pushed, as if the change was her choice instead of the result of Vivian's surgical strike at her confidence. "I'm fine, just tired." He moved closer, and she found herself stepping back instinctively. The motion was subtle, but in the empty office it felt like a chasm opening between them. "Camille." His voice was softer now, worried. "What's wrong?" She wanted to tell him everything. About lunch, about his mother's ultimatum, about the doubts that were eating her alive. But how do you ask someone if their feelings are real without revealing your own desperation? How do you voice fears that might destroy the very thing you're trying to protect? "I had lunch with your mother today." Julian went very still. "What?" "She invited me." Actually, it felt more like a command. Camille's voice was steadier than she felt. "She wanted to discuss my professional relationship with you." Something dangerous flickered in Julian's eyes. "What exactly did she say?" "She told me about Dr. Moore." The name hung in the air like a curse. Julian's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, understanding, and then something that looked like devastation. "She told you about Elizabeth?" "She told me you have a pattern," Camille said quietly, "of confusing professional care with personal connection, of seeing love where there's only gratitude." Julian ran a hand through his hair, destroying its perfect styling. "And you believed her?" It wasn't a question, and the resignation in his voice cut through her like broken glass. "I don't know what to believe," Camille admitted. "How can I? 5 years of taking care of your schedule, your coffee, your needs. How do I know the difference between love and habit? How do you?" Julian stared at her for a long moment, and she watched something break behind his eyes. "You want to know about Elizabeth?" His voice was harder now, defensive. "You're right. I did develop feelings for her. I was going through the worst period of my life. My father had just died. The company was struggling. My mother was pressuring me about marriage. Elizabeth was the only person who seemed to see me as more than a collection of responsibilities and expectations." Camille felt sick, Vivian's words proving themselves true. But you know what the difference is? Julian continued, stepping closer despite her earlier retreat. With Elizabeth, I spent 1 hour a week in her office talking about my problems. With you, I spend every day watching you anticipate things I didn't even know I needed. With Elizabeth, our conversations were about my past traumas. With you, our silences are comfortable. With Elizabeth, I was a patient trying to heal. With you, I'm just Julian. His words should have been reassuring, but doubt had taken root too deeply. How do you know? She pressed. How can you be sure you're not just repeating the same mistake with someone new? Julian's jaw tightened. Because Elizabeth never brought me coffee without being asked. She never stayed late when I was overwhelmed. She never looked at me like I was worth something beyond my bank account or my last name. His voice dropped to a whisper. She never made me feel like the man I am was enough, separate from everything I own. Tears pricked Camille's eyes, but she blinked them back. Your mother offered me a job, executive assistant position with a 40% raise. All I have to do is resign and walk away. And what did you tell her? I told her I'd think about it. Julian's face went pale. I see. Do you? Camille's voice cracked. Because I've been thinking about it all afternoon and I can't figure out what's real anymore. Is this conversation happening because you care about me, or because you need me to keep your life running smoothly? When you look at me, do you see Camille Evans, or do you see the woman who makes sure your world doesn't fall apart? Julian was quiet for so long that Camille thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with honesty. I see the woman who stayed late on my birthday last year, even though I never told anyone it was my birthday. I see the woman who somehow knew I was having nightmares about my father's death because you started leaving chamomile tea on my desk without explanation. I see the woman who makes me laugh during conference calls with terrible clients because you write ridiculous observations on the margins of my notes. Camille's breath caught. She remembered all of those moments, small gestures she'd thought he'd never noticed. I see the woman who cried at her desk when you thought no one was looking after we had to let Marcus go in the last round of layoffs. I see someone who treats the cleaning staff with the same respect she shows board members. I see someone who has never once asked me for anything more than what she's earned. Julian, if this is just transference, he said quietly, then I've been transferring for 5 years. If what I feel for you is just gratitude for professional competence, then I must be grateful for things that have nothing to do with work. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity burning in his dark eyes. Tell me something, Camille. In 5 years, have I ever thanked you for making me feel less lonely? Because that's not in your job description. The question broke something open inside her chest. All the doubt, all the fear, all of Vivian's carefully planted poison seemed to lose its power in the face of such simple truth. She said you'd realize you made the same mistake twice, Camille whispered. Maybe I have, Julian said softly. Maybe the mistake was not recognizing sooner that what I feel for you has nothing to do with therapy sessions or professional boundaries. Maybe the mistake was waiting 5 years to tell you that you're the best part of my day, every day. Outside, the city sparkled in the growing darkness, but inside the empty office, 2 people stood at the edge of something that could either save them or destroy everything they'd built. I'm scared, Camille admitted. So am I, Julian replied. But I'm more scared of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what we could have been. The space between them felt electric, charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. What happens now? She asked. Julian's smile was small but genuine. Now we decide if we're brave enough to find out. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of December snow that turned Manhattan into a postcard. Camille stood at her apartment window in Brooklyn, watching the flakes drift past the fire escape, her phone heavy in her hand. Julian had texted an hour ago, just her address and a question mark. Nothing more, but somehow, she understood exactly what he was asking. She'd spent the night replaying their conversation, the weight of his words settling into her bones like warmth after a long winter. The doubt Vivian had planted was still there, but smaller now, overwhelmed by something stronger. The memory of Julian's voice when he'd said she made him feel less lonely. Her buzzer rang at exactly 10 a.m. "It's me," came his voice through the intercom, and even those 2 words carried enough vulnerability to make her heart race. When she opened the door to the 4th floor walk-up, Julian stood in the hallway holding 2 cups of coffee and looking completely out of place. His wool coat probably cost more than her monthly rent, and his leather shoes weren't made for slushy sidewalks, but his expression was uncertain in a way that made him seem younger than his 39 years. "I brought Ethiopian," he said, offering her a cup. "Single origin. You remembered. She accepted the coffee, their fingers brushing in a contact that sent electricity up her arm. I remember everything about you, he said quietly. That's been my problem for months. They stood there in her doorway, neither moving to let him in or send him away, both aware that this moment was a threshold neither of them could uncross. Can I come in? He asked finally. Camille stepped aside, suddenly hyper-aware of her tiny studio apartment. The Murphy bed folded against the wall, the second-hand furniture, the stack of library books on her kitchen table, everything that marked the distance between their worlds. Julian moved through the space slowly, taking in details with the same careful attention he paid to important contracts. His gaze lingered on the small bookshelf crammed with worn paperbacks, the single photograph of her parents on the windowsill, the careful arrangement of throw pillows that made the thrift store couch look intentional. It's perfect, he said, and the sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. It's tiny. It's you. He turned to face her, and the way he looked at her, like she was something precious he was afraid to break, made her breath catch. It feels like home in a way my penthouse never has. They sat on opposite ends of her small couch, the space between them charged with everything they'd admitted and everything they still couldn't say. Julian looked different here, without the armor of his corner office and $1,000 suits. More human, more reachable. Tell me about your parents, he said, nodding toward the photograph. They both worked double shifts to put me through college, Camille said, following his gaze. Mom was a nurse at Brooklyn Methodist. Dad drove trucks for a shipping company. They died in a car accident 3 years ago. Julian's expression softened. I'm sorry. I should have known that. How could you? I never told you. She curled her legs under her, studying his profile. You know my work habits and my coffee preferences, but you don't know that I cry during every Disney movie, or that I'm terrified of butterflies, or that I haven't been on a real date in 2 years because no one interesting ever asked. I'm asking now. The words hung in the air between them, simple and complicated at the same time. This isn't a date, Camille said softly. This is two people trying to figure out if they're brave enough to blow up their entire lives. Julian's laugh was rueful. Is that what we're doing? Aren't we? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the snow falling outside her window. Yesterday, after you left, I called Elizabeth. Camille's stomach clenched. Your therapist? Former therapist. I wanted to understand what my mother told you, to see if she was right about the pattern. Julian turned to face her fully. Do you know what Elizabeth said? Camille shook her head, afraid to hear the answer. She said transference is about need, about a patient projecting their desire for care onto someone who's paid to provide it. She said what I felt for her was real, but it was about healing, not love. Julian's voice dropped. Then she asked me to describe how I felt about you. What did you tell her? I told her that with her I felt understood. With you I feel known. I told her that therapy made me feel better about myself, but you make me want to be better, period. Julian reached across the space between them, his fingers barely grazing her wrist. Elizabeth said that was the difference between transference and love. One is about receiving care. The other is about giving it. Camille felt tears prick her eyes. She said that. She also said that love between people with different amounts of power is always complicated, but that doesn't make it less real. It just makes it more important to be honest about what you want from each other. The weight of his words settled between them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in temporary peace. What do you want from me? Camille asked quietly. Julian's answer came without hesitation. Everything. Your terrible jokes during boring meetings. Your opinion on decisions that have nothing to do with work. Your hand in mine when I can't sleep. Your voice saying my name like it means something. He paused, his thumb tracing circles on her wrist. Your heart, if you're willing to risk it on someone who spent 39 years being afraid of exactly this feeling. Camille felt something crack open in her chest, warm and terrifying, and absolutely certain. I want all of that too, she whispered, but I'm scared of what it costs. What do you mean? Your mother made it clear that being with you means giving up the life I've built, my job, my independence, my sense of who I am outside of being useful to you. Camille's voice strengthened. I've worked too hard to become someone who takes care of herself to go back to being someone who needs taking care of. Julian's expression grew serious. Is that what you think I want? To take care of you? Isn't it? The powerful man and his grateful assistant? The classic fantasy? Camille. Julian shifted closer, his voice urgent. I don't want to take care of you. I want to build something with you. I want to be the person you call when you have good news, not just when there's a crisis at the office. I want to know what you dream about when you're not organizing my dreams." The sincerity in his voice was devastating. Camille felt the last of her defenses crumbling. "If we do this," she said slowly, "everything changes. Your mother will never accept me. The office will talk. People will think I slept my way into your bed." "Let them think what they want," Julian said fiercely. "I know the truth. You know the truth. That's all that matters." "Is it enough?" Julian's smile was soft and sure. "It's everything." The space between them disappeared as he leaned forward, his hand cupping her face with infinite gentleness. When his lips touched hers, it wasn't like the desperate kiss she'd imagined during lonely nights. It was something softer, deeper, a promise wrapped in tenderness, a question answered with absolute certainty. When they finally broke apart, Camille rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing like they'd just survived something beautiful and terrifying. "So what happens now?" she asked. Julian's smile was radiant. "Now we stop pretending we're just colleagues who happen to be perfect for each other." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside Camille's tiny apartment, winter felt like the beginning of spring. Monday morning arrived like a reckoning. Camille stood in the lobby of Meridian Tower at 6:25 a.m., her reflection in the polished marble walls, showing a woman who looked the same but felt fundamentally different. The weekend had changed everything, not just the kiss, but the quiet hours that followed. Julian making scrambled eggs in her tiny kitchen, his expensive shirt sleeves rolled up as he navigated her ancient stove. The way he'd laughed at her collection of mismatched coffee mugs. How they'd fallen asleep on her couch watching old movies, his arm around her shoulders, like the most natural thing in the world. Now, walking into their shared workspace, everything felt like walking on a tightrope over an abyss. Julian was already at his desk when she arrived, immaculate as always in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car. But when he looked up and saw her, his professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something warm and private that made her stomach flutter. "Good morning, Camille." His voice was carefully neutral, but her name sounded different when he said it now, like a secret they shared. "Good morning, Mr. Carrington." The formality felt strange after spending the weekend calling him Julian, but the office had rules, even if they were breaking them in every other way. They fell into their usual rhythm: coffee, schedule review, morning briefings, but underneath the professional veneer, everything hummed with new electricity. When Julian handed her a file, their fingers brushed and lingered. When she leaned over his desk to point out a calendar conflict, she caught him breathing in the scent of her perfume. It should have been perfect. It should have felt like everything falling into place. Instead, Camille felt like she was waiting for a bomb to explode. The explosion came at 10:30 a.m., in the form of David Chen knocking on Julian's office door with an expression that meant trouble. "Mr. Carrington, there are some people here to see you. They say it's urgent." Through the glass walls, Camille could see 3 figures in expensive suits standing near the elevator bank. She recognized the woman immediately, Vivian Carrington, looking like she'd dressed for war in a navy suit that could have armored a battleship. The 2 men with her had the predatory stillness of corporate lawyers. Julian's jaw tightened. "Send them in." "All of them?" David asked uncertainly. "All of them." Camille watched the small procession march into Julian's office like an occupying army. Through the glass, she could see Vivian's mouth moving rapidly, her gestures sharp and precise. Julian remained seated behind his desk, his posture rigid with the kind of control that came from years of practice. The conversation lasted 27 minutes. Camille knew because she watched every second tick by on her computer clock, her stomach churning with dread. When the office door finally opened, the lawyers left first, their expressions grim. Vivienne paused at Julian's desk, said something that made his face go completely blank, then walked out with her head held high. She stopped at Camille's desk. "I believe we had an agreement about timing, dear," Vivienne said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of disappointed authority that could make grown men apologize for breathing. "Monday morning, wasn't it?" "Mrs. Carrington, I'm afraid the offer has been withdrawn." Vivian's smile was sharp as winter. Julian made his choice quite clear in there. "I do hope you're prepared for the consequences." After Vivienne disappeared into the elevator, the office fell into the kind of silence that felt like the aftermath of a natural disaster. Camille stared at her computer screen without seeing it, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process what had just happened. Julian emerged from his office 15 minutes later, his face pale but determined. "Camille, could you clear my afternoon? We need to talk." Of course. Should I? Not here. Julian's voice was tight. Somewhere private. An hour later, they sat in a small cafe 3 blocks from the office, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of lunch-hour Manhattan. Julian hadn't touched his coffee, and Camille was beginning to understand why. "My mother knows," he said without preamble, "about this weekend, about us." Camille's blood turned to ice. "How?" "She had me followed. Professional investigators. Photographs. The whole theatrical production." Julian's laugh was bitter. "Apparently I can't buy a cup of coffee in Brooklyn without it becoming evidence in my mother's case against my personal happiness." "Julian, I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize. This isn't your fault." His voice was fierce with protectiveness. "This is what my mother does when she can't control a situation. She collects ammunition and declares war." "What kind of ammunition?" Julian was quiet for so long that Camille thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "She's threatening to call an emergency board meeting. She wants to have me declared unfit to run the company due to poor judgment and compromised decision-making." The words hit Camille like a physical blow. "She can do that. She owns 43% of Carrington Industries. Her shares, combined with her allies on the board, give her enough influence to make my life very difficult." Julian finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was devastating. "She's claiming that my relationship with an employee represents a pattern of poor boundaries that makes me a liability to the company." Camille felt sick. "Because of Dr. Moore. Because of Dr. Moore. Because of you. Because of any decision I've ever made that didn't align with her vision of what my life should look like." Julian reached across the table, his fingers finding hers. "She's also threatening to destroy your reputation. Leaked stories about inappropriate workplace relationships, questions about how you really got your position, implications that you've been manipulating me for years." The cafe seemed to spin around Camille. 5 years of building her career, of proving herself in a world that already questioned her competence because of her background, and it could all be destroyed by gossip and innuendo. "What did you tell her?" she asked quietly. "I told her that what happens between us is none of her business. I told her that threatening you was the fastest way to make me her enemy instead of her son." Julian's grip on her hand tightened. "I told her I'd rather lose the company than lose you." Camille stared at him in shock. "Julian, you can't be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life. That company is your entire world. It's your father's legacy, your life's work. My father's legacy is a business built on other people's dreams. My life's work has been making money for people who already have more than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. Julian's voice was quiet but absolute. "You're the first thing that's ever made me feel like I might be worth something beyond a quarterly profit report." Tears burned behind Camille's eyes. "You can't throw away everything you've built for me." "I'm not throwing it away. I'm choosing something better." Julian brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "But I need to know that you're choosing it too, because this is going to get ugly, Camille. My mother doesn't fight fair, and she's going to do everything in her power to make you regret ever caring about me." The weight of the decision pressed down on Camille like gravity. She could walk away now, take whatever job she could find, and let Julian fight his mother without dragging her down with him. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice. But looking at him across the small table, seeing the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide, she realized that safety had never been the point. "What if we fight back?" she said quietly. Julian blinked in surprise. "What? Your mother thinks she can manipulate us because she believes I'm some gold-digging assistant, and you're a confused rich boy making bad decisions. What if we prove her wrong?" Camille's voice grew stronger. "What if we show the board and the world that what we have is real? That we're stronger together than either of us is alone?" Something fierce and hopeful flickered in Julian's eyes. "That's a dangerous game, Camille. If we lose, at least we'll lose fighting for something that matters." She squeezed his hand. "I'm tired of being afraid of your mother. I'm tired of feeling like I have to apologize for caring about you. And I'm really tired of letting other people decide what I deserve." Julian's smile was slow and devastating. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying, let's give them something real to talk about." Camille leaned forward, her eyes bright with determination. "I'm saying let's stop hiding and start living." The kiss he gave her across the small cafe table tasted like courage and felt like coming home. Outside, the December wind howled against the windows. But inside, 2 people had just declared war on everything that wanted to keep them apart. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m., and by Wednesday evening, the entire 42nd floor of Meridian Tower felt like a war zone. Camille sat in Julian's office as the city lights began to twinkle outside, surrounded by legal documents, financial reports, and the debris of a battle they were determined to win. Julian paced behind his desk, his usually perfect appearance disheveled from hours of phone calls with board members, lawyers, and anyone else who might influence the outcome. "Richardson is with us," Julian said, hanging up from another call. "That's 4 votes we can count on." "And we need how many?" Camille asked, though she already knew the answer. 7 out of 12 to maintain control. Julian rubbed his temples. "Vivian has 5 locked up, maybe 6 if she gets to Patterson before we do." The math was brutal, but not impossible. What worried Camille more was the cost of winning. Over the past 3 days, Julian had burned through favors accumulated over years, called in debts he'd hoped never to collect, and made promises that would reshape his business relationships forever. All for her. All to protect what they'd found together. "There's something else," Julian said quietly. "Thompson called an hour ago. He's heard rumors that the story is going to break in the financial press tomorrow morning." Camille's stomach dropped. "What story?" "Billionaire CEO's inappropriate relationship with employee. The usual salacious nonsense, but with enough truth mixed in to be damaging." Julian's voice was tight with anger. "They'll paint you as a manipulative gold digger, and me as a fool who can't separate business from pleasure." "Maybe I should resign," Camille said quietly, "before the meeting. Make a statement that we were never involved professionally, that it all happened after I left the company." "Absolutely not." Julian's response was immediate and fierce. "That would be admitting we did something wrong. It would be admitting that what we feel for each other is shameful, instead of the best thing that's ever happened to either of us." Camille looked at him, really looked at him, the man who'd spent the past week risking everything he'd built for the chance to build something new with her, who'd faced down his mother's threats and his board's disapproval without flinching, who'd chosen love over safety, over certainty, over the comfortable prison of other people's expectations. "What if we lose tomorrow?" she asked. Julian stopped pacing and turned to face her. "Then we lose, but we'll lose together, and we'll build something new together. There are other companies, other opportunities. There's only one you." The simple certainty in his voice broke something open in Camille's chest. Here was a man who'd been taught from birth that his worth was measured in quarterly earnings and stock prices, choosing to measure it in something infinitely more precious. The look in her eyes, when he said her name, like it was the most important word he knew. A soft knock on the office door interrupted the moment. David Chen peered in, his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. Carrington, but there's someone here to see you. She says it's important." "If it's another reporter, it's Dr. Elizabeth Moore." Julian went very still. Camille felt her blood turn to ice. Of all the people who could appear at this moment, Elizabeth Moore was perhaps the most dangerous. The woman whose relationship with Julian had provided Vivienne with ammunition, whose professional opinion could destroy them with a single statement about patterns and transference. "Send her in," Julian said quietly. Dr. Elizabeth Moore was not what Camille had expected. She was probably in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of understated elegance that spoke of genuine confidence rather than performance. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, and her eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from years of helping people navigate their deepest truths. "Julian, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I felt I needed to speak with you before tomorrow's meeting." Elizabeth's gaze moved to Camille. "And you must be Ms. Evans. I've heard quite a lot about you." Camille braced herself for judgment, for the kind of professional assessment that would dissect her feelings and find them wanting. Instead, Elizabeth smiled. "I wanted to thank you." "Thank me." Camille blinked in confusion. "In our conversation the other day, Julian described how you make him feel, not just cared for but challenged, not just appreciated but truly seen." Elizabeth's voice was warm with genuine approval. "In 15 years of practice, I've rarely heard someone speak about love with such clarity, about the difference between what they need and what they can give." Julian looked stunned. "Elizabeth, I don't understand." "Your mother called me yesterday," Elizabeth continued calmly. "She wanted me to make a statement about your psychological fitness, to suggest that your relationship with Ms. Evans represents a pattern of unhealthy attachment. She offered me quite a substantial consulting fee for my professional opinion." Camille felt the room tilt. And I told her that love is not a pathology," Elizabeth said firmly. that the ability to form healthy, reciprocal relationships with appropriate people is actually a sign of psychological maturity, not instability. She turned to Julian. I also told her that if she truly cared about your well-being, she would want you to be with someone who brings out your best self, rather than someone who simply fits her social requirements. The relief that flooded through Julian's expression was palpable. Elizabeth, I can't thank you enough. There's more. Elizabeth's expression grew serious. Your mother also hired a private investigator to dig into Ms. Evans' background, looking for anything that might suggest ulterior motives. Camille's heart stopped. And did they find anything? Elizabeth's smile was radiant. They found a woman who's worked 2 jobs since she was 16, who graduated college with honors while caring for aging parents, who's never had so much as a parking ticket. They found someone who's turned down multiple offers from headhunters, trying to poach her for higher-paying positions, who's donated time to literacy programs at the Brooklyn Public Library, and who has exactly $47,000 in savings account that she's never touched despite several family medical emergencies. Julian stared at Camille in amazement. You never told me about any of that. You never asked, Camille said softly, and it wasn't relevant to doing my job. It's relevant now, Elizabeth said firmly, because it proves that your feelings for Julian have nothing to do with his money and everything to do with who he is as a person, just as his feelings for you have nothing to do with convenience and everything to do with genuine connection. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I'll be giving the board my professional assessment tomorrow. I'll be telling them that Julian Carrington is one of the most psychologically healthy individuals I've ever worked with, and that his ability to form this kind of authentic relationship actually makes him a better leader, not a worse one. After Elizabeth left, Julian and Camille sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Did that really just happen? Camille asked finally. I think we just gained our 7th vote, Julian said, his voice filled with wonder. More than that. Camille stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city that had tried to keep them apart. We just found out who we really are, not who your mother thinks we are or who the papers will say we are, but who we actually are when someone looks past all the noise. Julian joined her at the window, his reflection mixing with hers in the glass. And who are we? Camille turned to face him, her heart full of certainty that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. We're 2 people who found something real in a world full of facades. We're 2 people brave enough to fight for love even when it's inconvenient. We're 2 people who are about to show your mother that some things are more powerful than money, influence, or social expectations. Julian's kiss was soft and sure, a promise sealed in the face of tomorrow's uncertainty. Ready for tomorrow? He asked. Camille smiled, feeling more ready than she'd ever felt for anything. Let's go win this thing. Outside, Manhattan glittered in the winter darkness, but inside the office where they'd first found each other, 2 people prepared to defend something worth defending, a love that had grown quietly, honestly, and with the kind of depth that could weather any storm. Tomorrow would determine whether they kept Julian's empire or lost it. But tonight, they already knew they'd won something far more valuable, each other. The boardroom of Carrington Industries had hosted hostile takeovers, merger negotiations, and decisions that moved billions of dollars across global markets. But it had never witnessed anything quite like the battle for Julian Carrington's heart. At exactly 2 p.m. on Thursday, 12 of the most powerful people in New York finance filed into the mahogany-paneled room overlooking Central Park. Camille sat in the small observation area, technically there as Julian's assistant, but really there as the woman whose love was about to be put on trial by people who measured worth in stock options and quarterly projections. Vivienne Carrington entered last, dressed in armor-like black and carrying herself with the kind of regal confidence that came from never doubting her own righteousness. She didn't look at Camille, but her presence filled the room like winter air. Julian sat at the head of the massive conference table, impeccable in his navy suit, but carrying a tension in his shoulders that Camille could read like a familiar book. When their eyes met across the room, he offered her the smallest smile, a private moment of courage shared in public. Ladies and gentlemen, began Board Chairman Harrison Blackwell, we're here to address concerns raised about the leadership and judgment of our CEO, Julian Carrington. For the next hour, Camille watched Vivienne systematically dismantle her son's character with the precision of a master surgeon. She spoke of patterns of poor judgment, of personal relationships that compromised professional objectivity, of a young man who'd never learned to separate his emotional needs from his business responsibilities. My son cancelled a merger worth $2 billion last month, Vivian said, her voice carrying just enough maternal disappointment to be devastating. When I asked him why, he said he couldn't concentrate on the details because he was distracted by personal matters. Is this the kind of leadership Carrington Industries deserves? Julian's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. They had agreed he would let his mother present her case fully before responding. Furthermore, Vivian continued, Julian's relationship with his assistant represents a fundamental breach of professional ethics. Miss Evans has been privy to confidential information, has influence over his schedule and decisions, and now we discover she's been leveraging that position for personal gain. That's not true. The words escaped Camille's lips before she could stop them. The entire boardroom turned to stare at her. Vivian's eyes glittered with triumph. She'd wanted exactly this kind of emotional outburst. Ms. Evans, Chairman Blackwell said carefully, you're here as an observer. She's here as my colleague, Julian interrupted, standing, and she has every right to defend herself against false accusations. Julian, sit down, Vivian commanded, with the voice that had controlled his childhood. No, Julian's voice was calm but absolute. I've listened to you tear apart the best thing that's ever happened to me, and now you're going to listen to the truth. He moved around the table with the kind of controlled power that had made him a billionaire before 40. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority that came from years of commanding rooms exactly like this one. My mother says I'm distracted. She's right. For the first time in my adult life, I'm distracted by something more important than profit margins. Julian's gaze found Camille's. She says I cancelled a merger because of personal matters. Also true. I cancelled it because spending 18 hours a day negotiating with people who wanted to strip mine a family business made me physically sick. And for the first time, I had someone in my life who reminded me that money isn't the only thing that matters. Murmurs rippled around the table. This wasn't the defense anyone had expected. She says Camille leveraged her position for personal gain. Let me tell you what Camille Evans has gained in 5 years of working for me. Julian's voice grew stronger. She's gained carpal tunnel from typing my correspondence. She's gained stress headaches from managing my impossible schedule. She's gained exactly 0 promotions, 0 raises beyond standard adjustments, and 0 benefits beyond what every other employee receives. Julian moved closer to the observation area, his eyes never leaving Camille's face. What she's gained is my respect, my admiration, and eventually, my love. Not because she wanted something from me, but because she gave me something I didn't even know I needed. The chance to be worth something beyond my bank account. Vivian's composure finally cracked. Julian, you're being ridiculous. This woman, Julian said, his voice rising, knows that I have nightmares about my father's death and leaves chamomile tea on my desk without being asked. This woman stayed late on Christmas Eve to finish a project so I could spend the holiday with family. Family that includes the mother who's now trying to destroy her reputation. This woman has never once asked me for anything except the chance to do her job well. He turned back to the board, his expression fierce with protectiveness. You want to question my judgment? Question this. I'm 39 years old, and until 6 months ago, I measured my worth by the approval of people in this room. I made decisions based on what would look good in quarterly reports, rather than what felt right in my gut. I was successful, profitable, and completely empty. Julian's voice dropped to something more intimate, more honest. Camille Evans changed that, not because she wanted to manipulate me, but because she saw something in me worth caring about when I'd forgotten it existed. She made me remember that businesses are supposed to serve people, not the other way around. The room was completely silent now, hanging on every word. So yes, I'm different. I'm distracted by the revolutionary idea that I might be worth loving for who I am rather than what I own. I'm compromised by the belief that a life built on genuine connection might be more valuable than one built on quarterly earnings. And if that makes me unfit to lead this company, then maybe this company doesn't deserve the kind of leader I'm capable of being. Julian moved to Camille's side, taking her hand in full view of the 12 most powerful people in his professional world. Camille Evans is the best person I've ever known. She's honest, compassionate, brilliant, and she makes me want to be the kind of man worthy of her love. If choosing her over your approval means losing this boardroom, then I choose her, every time, without hesitation. The silence that followed was deafening. Camille felt tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the raw courage it had taken for Julian to strip away every defense and offer his truth to people who could destroy him for it. Finally, Dr. Elizabeth Moore, who had been invited to provide psychological assessment, stood to speak. "I've observed Mr. Carrington for 3 years," she said calmly, "both in therapy and in his relationship with Ms. Evans. What I see is not a man compromised by poor judgment, but a man who has learned to integrate his personal values with his professional responsibilities. The qualities that make him care deeply about Ms. Evans, loyalty, integrity, the ability to see beyond surface appearances, are exactly the qualities that make him an exceptional leader." She looked directly at Vivian. "Mrs. Carrington, you raised a son who's capable of inspiring fierce loyalty, making difficult decisions under pressure, and putting principle above profit. Those aren't the characteristics of a weak man. They're the characteristics of a great one." Chairman Blackwell called for a brief recess, and the board members filed out to deliberate. Camille and Julian found themselves alone in the observation area, holding hands and breathing like they'd just survived a natural disaster. "Whatever happens," Camille whispered, "what you just did was the bravest thing I've ever seen." "It was the easiest thing I've ever done," Julian replied. "Loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done." When the board returned 20 minutes later, Chairman Blackwell's expression was unreadable. "The board has reached a decision," he announced. "By a vote of 8-4, we affirm our confidence in Julian Carrington's leadership of this company." The relief that flooded through Camille was so intense, she felt dizzy. But Blackwell wasn't finished. "However, we also recognize that this situation raises important questions about company policy regarding relationships between employees at different levels. Therefore, effective immediately, we're promoting Ms. Evans to Director of Executive Relations with appropriate compensation and a seat at our monthly strategy meetings." Camille stared in shock. They hadn't just won, they'd been validated. "Furthermore," Blackwell continued with the hint of a smile, "we're implementing new policies to ensure that personal relationships are handled transparently and professionally. Mr. Carrington, we trust you'll help develop these guidelines." As the board members filed out, offering congratulations and handshakes, Vivienne remained seated at the far end of the table. Julian approached her slowly, Camille at his side. "Mother," he said quietly. Vivienne looked up at her son, and for the first time Camille saw something other than calculation in her eyes, something that looked almost like respect. "You've changed," Vivienne said finally. "Yes," Julian agreed, "for the better." Vivienne's gaze moved to Camille, studying her with new attention. "Ms. Evans, Mrs. Carrington, I underestimated you," Vivienne said simply. "I thought you were after his money. I didn't realize you were after something much more dangerous." "What's that?" Camille asked. Vivienne's smile was small but genuine. "His happiness. That's infinitely more powerful than money, and infinitely more threatening to mothers who want to control their children's lives." She stood, gathering her purse with dignity and tact despite her defeat. "Julian, your father would be proud of the man you've become. And Ms. Evans." She paused at the door. "Welcome to the family. It's going to be an interesting journey." Alone in the boardroom where their future had been decided, Julian and Camille held each other as the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, painting everything in gold. "So," Julian said softly, "Director of Executive Relations? I guess that means I'll be working closely with the CEO, Camille replied, her voice full of joy and possibility. "Very closely," Julian agreed, and kissed her with the freedom of a man who had finally learned that the best things in life were worth fighting for. Outside, Manhattan hummed with its usual chaos, but inside the boardroom of Carrington Industries, two people had just proven that love wasn't just powerful enough to survive in a world of money and influence, it was powerful enough to transform it. 2 years later, the morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their shared apartment painted everything in gold, and Camille Evans Carrington still couldn't believe this was her life. She stood at the kitchen island of their Brooklyn Heights home, a compromise between Julian's Manhattan penthouse and her tiny studio, though it turned out to be the perfect choice for both of them. From here she could see the harbor, the bridge and the Manhattan skyline, where she'd once watched from a distance, never imagining she'd be living a love story worthy of the city itself. "Good morning, Director Evans Carrington." Julian's voice came from behind her, warm with the kind of happiness that had become his default setting over the past 2 years. "Good morning, Mr. Carrington," she replied, turning to accept the cup of Ethiopian coffee he offered. Some rituals were too precious to abandon, even when everything else had changed. Julian wore jeans and a sweater instead of his usual armor of expensive suits. It was Saturday, and Saturdays belonged to them. His hair was slightly mussed from sleep, and there was something lighter about him now, as if the weight he'd carried for 39 years had finally been lifted. "Any regrets?" he asked, the question that had become their weekend tradition. "About giving up my tiny apartment for this palace, about marrying my former boss, about becoming a director at one of the most prestigious companies in New York?" Camille pretended to consider seriously. "None whatsoever." "Good," Julian said, pulling her close, "because I have something that might test that resolve." From his pocket, he produced an envelope with elegant script that Camille recognized immediately. "Your mother's handwriting," she said, with only the slightest trepidation. The relationship with Vivienne had evolved from open hostility to grudging respect to something that almost resembled genuine affection, but Vivienne's surprises still carried the potential for chaos. "Read it," Julian encouraged. Camille opened the envelope and read aloud. "Julian and Camille, your presence is requested at the annual Carrington Foundation Gala next Friday evening. Camille, I've taken the liberty of arranging for Marcus at Bergdorf's to help with your gown. Julian, try not to let success go to your head. With love and admiration, Vivienne." "She signed it with love," Camille marveled. "She also arranged for your gown at Bergdorf's. I think that might be her version of a peace treaty." Camille laughed, still amazed by how much had changed. The Carrington Foundation, focused on educational opportunities for underprivileged youth, had been her idea, born from late-night conversations about how to use Julian's wealth for something meaningful. Vivienne had not only supported the initiative, but had thrown her considerable social influence behind it, turning it into one of the city's most successful charitable organizations. "There's more," Julian said, his voice carrying a note of excitement that made Camille look up from the letter. "More what?" "News. Good news." Julian's smile was radiant. "Richardson called yesterday. The Hartford project is moving forward." Camille felt her heart leap. The Hartford project was their most ambitious venture yet, a series of affordable housing developments that would provide quality homes for working families without displacing existing communities. It had been Camille's suggestion, born from her own experience growing up in Brooklyn, and Julian had spent months making it financially viable. "All of it?" she asked. "All 6 buildings, 2,000 units, full funding approved." Julian's arms tightened around her. "We did it, Camille. We're going to change lives." She buried her face in his shoulder, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd accomplished together. 2 years ago, she'd been an assistant, wondering if her feelings were real. Now she was a director, a wife, and a partner in creating something that would outlast them both. "I love you," she whispered against his neck. "I love you too," he replied, and the words still carried the wonder of a man who'd never expected to find this kind of happiness. They stood there in their sun-drenched kitchen, holding each other and planning a future that seemed unlimited in its possibilities. Through the windows, the city hummed with its usual energy, but their corner of Brooklyn felt like the center of the universe. Later that afternoon, they walked hand in hand through Prospect Park, past the spot where Julian had proposed 6 months earlier, not with a grand gesture or a photographer hiding in the bushes, but with a simple question asked while they shared a bench and watched children play. Camille wore her grandmother's ring, reset with stones that caught the light and threw it back in rainbow patterns, and Julian wore a wedding band that had belonged to his father. "Do you ever miss it?" Camille asked as they paused by the lake, where ducks glided across water that reflected the autumn sky. "The simplicity of before, when the hardest decision was what coffee to order?" Julian considered the question seriously, as he always did. "I miss the anticipation," he said finally. "The way my heart would race when you walked into my office, the careful dance we did around what we were feeling. But I wouldn't trade what we have now for anything." The anticipation was beautiful, but this, he gestured between them, encompassing 2 years of shared mornings, quiet evenings, challenges faced together, and dreams built side by side. "This is better than anything I ever dared to hope for." As they walked home through the tree-lined streets of their neighborhood, Camille thought about the path that had brought them here, from assistant and boss to partners in every sense of the word, from hiding their feelings to defending them in front of the world, from 2 people afraid of risking what they had to 2 people who'd discovered that love wasn't about playing it safe. It was about choosing each other every day, in small moments and grand gestures alike. That evening, as they cooked dinner together in their kitchen, Julian surprisingly competent with vegetables, Camille managing the complicated sauce they'd been perfecting for months, she realized that this was what happiness looked like, not the dramatic moments or the grand declarations, but the quiet rhythm of a life built on shared values, mutual respect, and the kind of love that made ordinary moments feel extraordinary. "What are you thinking about?" Julian asked, noticing her contemplative mood. "I'm thinking about that night," she said, "when I walked into your office with trembling lips, trying to hide what I'd been feeling for so long. The night everything changed. The night everything began," she corrected. "I used to think courage was about not being afraid. Now I know it's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway." Julian set down his knife and turned to face her fully. "And what was the right thing?" "Telling you the truth, even when I didn't know if you felt the same way. Even when your mother was offering me escape routes. Even when the whole world seemed designed to keep us apart." She reached up to touch his face, still amazed by the right to do so freely. The right thing was choosing love, even when it felt impossible. "Especially when it felt impossible," Julian agreed, capturing her hand and pressing it to his lips. As night fell over Brooklyn, they sat on their couch with takeout containers and planning documents for the foundation, talking through details and dreaming about impact. It was exactly the kind of evening that would have bored the old Julian, the one who measured success in stock prices and measured time in billable hours. But this Julian, the one who'd learned that the best things in life couldn't be quantified, found these quiet evenings with Camille to be the most valuable hours of his week. "I have a confession," Camille said, as they reviewed applications for the Foundation's scholarship program. "Oh, I used to dream about this. Not the foundation, not the apartment, not even the marriage exactly, but this feeling, the feeling of building something meaningful with someone who understood what mattered." She looked around their living room, at the bookshelves lined with both business texts and poetry, at the photographs that captured their journey from colleagues to partners to husband and wife. "I used to think this kind of happiness was for other people. People with different backgrounds, different histories, different kinds of luck. And now? Now I know that happiness isn't about luck. It's about choice. About choosing to believe you deserve love. About choosing to be vulnerable. About choosing to fight for what matters instead of accepting what feels safe." Julian pulled her closer, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder. "We chose well," he said softly. "We chose each other," Camille agreed. "Best decision I ever made." Outside their windows, Manhattan glittered across the water like a promise kept, and Brooklyn settled into the comfortable rhythm of evening. Somewhere in the city, other people were making choices about love and risk, about safety and courage, about what they were willing to fight for and what they were ready to let go. But in their corner of the world, Julian and Camille Carrington had already found their answer. Love wasn't just worth the risk, it was worth everything. And sometimes, if you were brave enough to tell the truth with trembling lips and trust someone with your whole heart, the universe rewarded that courage with something beautiful enough to last a lifetime. Some love stories end with a kiss, others end with a promise. This one ended with the quiet certainty that the best stories don't really end at all. They just keep growing, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one moment of choosing each other at a time. And in the morning there would be coffee and conversation, and another day of building something beautiful together. It was more than enough. It was everything. Have you ever taken a leap of faith for love and discovered it changed your entire life? What happens when you realize that the best stories aren't about finding love, but about choosing it every single day? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.